Imagine for a moment that you have been transported back to the Middle Ages, but forget about the clanging of swords. Listen to another sound, the steady creaking of stone millstones. What is most valuable in this world? Gold. Precious stones? What if I told you that a handful of dark, shriveled peppercorns could be worth more than a warhorse, and that the right to eat a piece of white bread was more important than the right to carry a sword? Today, we're not just going to talk about food. We will decipher the secret language of the medieval table, where every bite you took silently revealed who you were, the master of your life or a humble laborer. Get ready. Our culinary journey into the past is about to begin. Let us begin our journey at the hearth of a simple farmer, where every meal was dictated by the logic of survival and the wisdom of nature. Their table is an honest and understandable story about the land, labor, and the seasons. Bread was the basis of life. But it was not just a product. The process of making it was a whole ritual that took a lot of effort. Women ground rye or barley on heavy hand mills. Their monotonous creaking was the familiar morning music in any village. The dough was kneaded with plain water and leaven, then carried to the communal village oven. This oven was not just a place for baking, but also the center of social life, where news and rumors were exchanged. It often belonged to the local lord, and one loaf of bread had to be given to him in exchange for its use. The resulting bread was dense, with a dark, crumbly crumb and a sour but pleasant bread aroma. It did not go stale for several days and provided energy for hard work in the fields from dawn to dusk. Interesting fact, the famous baker's dozen, 13 instead of 12, appeared in the Middle Ages. Laws against underweight bread were very strict, and bakers added an extra loaf to each dozen to avoid accidental mistakes and huge fines. If bread was the staple, then soup, or potage, was the heart of the table. Imagine a perpetually boiling pot over the fire that was rarely emptied completely. New ingredients were simply added to the leftovers from yesterday's stew, creating a unique, ever-changing flavor. The main ingredients were legumes, peas or lentils, supplemented by root vegetables that we would now call forgotten. Parsnips, rutabagas, and, of course, the familiar turnips and onions. Potatoes, tomatoes, and sweet peppers were not yet known in Europe at that time. This thick, aromatic soup, smelling of earth and smoke, was the main source of vitamins and kept people warm in cold weather. Plates, as we know them today, were often unavailable to ordinary people. Instead, they used trenches, thick slices of stale bread. They would put thick soup or pieces of meat on them, and after eating, this edible plate, soaked in juices, could either be eaten or given to the dogs. It was the perfect waste-free system. Animal protein was not on the table every day, but the diet was not meager. The main source of food was chickens, the walking pantry of every family, which provided valuable eggs. Cows' or goats' milk was used to make simple cottage cheese and hard, strongly salted cheese, which could be stored for months, becoming only harder and more aromatic over time. Small fish could be caught in permitted streams and ponds. However, the surrounding forests were strictly off-limits. Peasants had what were known as forest rights. They could gather firewood, berries, mushrooms, and graze pigs, which were fattened on acorns. But hunting any game was considered an illegal act against the Lord. Salt was such a valuable resource that it was called white gold. Knowing how to properly salt meat or fish was not just a culinary skill, but a guarantee of survival for the family during the long winter months. So salt was guarded like the apple of one's eye. But to truly understand the medieval world, it is important to know not only what people ate, but also what they could not eat. There were two main barriers that reliably protected elite foods from ordinary people: the law of the Lord and the law of price. The first barrier was legal. The forests, full of deer, roe deer, and wild boars, were considered private property and hunting grounds for the nobility. Special officials, foresters with considerable power, enforced the ban. Hunting was not a means of obtaining food, but a noble sport, training, and a symbol of aristocratic status. Allowing commoners to hunt high game would have meant diminishing this privilege. Therefore, forest law was very strict, and violations were punished severely. The same applied to noble birds such as swans, peacocks, and herons. These birds were valued not for their taste, but for their beauty on the banquet table. They were living works of art, and serving them at the table was the exclusive prerogative of the wealthiest households. The second barrier was even more insurmountable: economic. Most products were not prohibited by law, but their cost made them completely inaccessible. White bread made from the finest wheat flour cost several times more than ordinary rye bread. Spices such as pepper and cloves were worth their weight in gold and were only available to the wealthiest merchants and nobility. Sugar was sold in pharmacies as medicine and cost a fortune, and such curiosities as almonds, rice, or citrus fruits brought to port cities were something from another world for peasants, akin to the desire of modern people to buy their own private island. It was an invisible but very strong wall dividing society. Saffron, which was used both as a spice and as a bright yellow food coloring, was so expensive that counterfeiting it was considered a crime in some cities. Merchants caught selling fake saffron faced huge fines. Now, leaving behind the smell of smoke and boiled turnips, we enter the echoing stone hall of the castle, lit by hundreds of candles and torches. Here, a feast is not about satisfying hunger. It is theater, politics, and a demonstration of power, where each dish has its own unique role. At the table, the nobles would be struck not by the taste, but by the appearance of the food. Medieval chefs were true illusionists, creating so-called sotelti, mystery dishes designed to deceive and surprise. Imagine a mythical creature being brought to the table, with the head and front part of a piglet and the rear part of a huge rooster, all sewn together and roasted. This dish was called cocentris and was intended not so much to satisfy as to shock the guests and demonstrate that the host chef was a true magician. Another popular special effect was the helmeted rooster. A roasted bird was dressed up in a paper helmet and given a spear made of a stick to hold in its wing, and then seated astride a roasted piglet. It was a whole nightly scene on a platter. They also served giant pies shaped like the host's castle, with towers, walls, and an inner courtyard, and each part of the pie could have its own completely different filling. The highlight of the culinary theater was the aforementioned pie, from which live birds flew out after it was cut, creating incredible commotion and delight in the hall. Spices were the real indicator of status. Pepper, cloves, ginger, cinnamon, nutmeg, all of these were currency, demonstrating the global connections and untold wealth of their owner. And they were used in the most unexpected combinations. It may seem strange to our taste, but meat was often cooked with sweet ingredients. Rabbit was stewed with figs and almonds. Pork was served with a sauce made from pomegranate and sugar, and game pâtés were generously sprinkled with raisins and dates. Sweet and salty on the same plate was a sign of sophistication and refined taste. One of the most popular dishes at feasts was blancmange. However, it was not a dessert, but a main course made from finely chopped chicken meat, which was cooked for a long time in almond milk with rice flour and sugar until it became a thick white cream. Almond milk was very popular in the kitchens of the nobility, especially during fasting periods when cow's milk was forbidden. Even the presentation was a statement. Jelly dishes were extremely popular. Just imagine a trembling, multicolored mosaic cube made of solidified broth, jelly, inside which, like prehistoric insects in amber, pieces of fish, boiled eggs, vegetables, and herbs were laid out perfectly evenly. Creating such a transparent and firm jelly required incredible skill. The culmination of this display of wealth was the gilding of food. Cooks took an unimaginable step. They covered a whole roasted swan or boar with the thinnest sheets of edible gold, transforming the dish not just into food, but into a precious ingot that could be eaten. As we know, there were almost no forks. Therefore, there was a whole set of rules for eating with your hands. Food should be picked up with only 3 fingers, the thumb, index, and middle fingers, without dirtying the palm or licking the fingers, which was considered a sign of aristocratic refinement and good manners. Finally, what did people drink in a world where water purity was a major problem? The answer to this question also depended on your position in society. In towns and villages, drinking water from wells or rivers was risky due to their proximity to sewage and waste disposal sites. Therefore, the simplest and safest method was to boil it. Water was boiled to make the same soups, as well as herbal teas from mint, chamomile, or thyme, which not only quenched thirst, but also often had practical benefits. Sitta, plain water sweetened with a spoonful of honey, was very popular. Milk and whey were also popular, nutritious, and affordable animal products. They could afford the luxury of drinking clean water from verified sources and springs, to which special aqueducts were sometimes built. But they did not limit themselves to plain water. A sign of status was thick, aromatic fruit juices, which were often boiled down to a syrup and then diluted with water. Juices made from imported or rare fruits, such as pomegranates or oranges, were particularly prized, seasoned with expensive spices to turn even a simple drink into yet another proof of one's wealth. And so, our long journey to the medieval table is coming to an end. We started with the simple idea that food can reveal status, and now we see how deep and multifaceted this language was. It was not just a declaration of wealth. It was a whole philosophy, an invisible boundary that separated not just the poor and the rich, but two completely different ways of perceiving the world and one's place in it. On one side of this border was the philosophy of unity with nature. The farmer's table was a reflection of his life, honest, pragmatic, and subject to the rhythms of the seasons. Every product was used down to the last crumb, as we saw in the example of the bread, plates, trenches. Every plant in the garden had its place. It was the wisdom of survival, the ability to take what the earth gave with gratitude and without excess. It was a world where the main value was life itself and the food that sustains it. On the other side is the philosophy of power over nature. The feast of the nobility was an act of creation, almost divine. Its purpose was not simply to satisfy hunger, but to impress, to subjugate the laws of physics and logic. Birds flying out of pies, meat covered with the thinnest layer of gold, edible sculptures. All this was a statement. I am so powerful that I can turn food into a miracle, into theater. Spices from the other side of the world were not just seasonings, but symbols of power over geography and trade. It was a world where the ability to shape reality at will was the highest value. So next time you're cooking dinner, try becoming a historian and archaeologist in your own kitchen for a moment. Take a closer look at what's in front of you. That simple carrot is the result of centuries of selection of its wild ancestors. That pinch of black pepper is a silent witness to the age of discovery and risky sea voyages. That rice is a reminder of the Great Silk Road and the cultural exchange between civilizations. Every product has an epic story behind it, full of human ambition, labor, discovery, and the pursuit of beauty. We didn't just study medieval menus. We learned to read one of the oldest and most honest languages of humanity, the language of food. And this language is everywhere, in the architecture of buildings, in patterns on clothing, in the lines of ancient books. History has left us countless such codes.